Okay, so by now, hopefully, you have logged on and you've seen your assignment for this week. It is I believe it's the introduction, if I remember correctly. This book is laid out a little bit differently from Jay Brooks Flippin's Jimmy Carter, The Politics of Family and the Rise of the Religious Right. It's a book that I read in the fall for my historical movements class. I'm in grad school. It does a really good job, really, of setting up and following through, really, with the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Ill-fated as it was, really, from the start. We're going to get into a little bit of that today. I just want to make sure that we're clear. Your assignment is to read Jay Brooks Flippin's introduction that's posted on Classroom as a PDF. And many thanks to Mrs. Crane for the app that she found that allows us to scan and upload a PDF in that fashion. The one thing that I was a little bit sad to see, though, was that it doesn't incorporate my highlights as well. As you guys know, I've always told you guys that when I assign a reading that I have done previously that has highlights and notes and things like that, to use those to sort of guide where you're headed with your reading. I've always said that. I think that's a great tool to use, but just with the technology and the way that it worked out, it's actually a really solid piece of technology where you take the picture and then it just whitewashes it. It takes away all the highlights. So that is the one sort of downside to that app. But that is your assignment, is to read that introduction and to do your 3-2-1 off of it. And yes, it is. It's a longer reading than perhaps normal. But again, you've got the whole week to get that reading done and to get that assignment done. What this is that I'm about to do just here over the next 10 to 15 minutes or so is just a really quick sort of supplementary piece on the presidency of Jimmy Carter, because it's really going to be important as we move forward into the 1980s and the sort of conservative swing, or the sort of swing back to conservatism, but especially sort of the rise, as the title of Flippin's book says, the rise of the religious right. This is a period in history where there's a lot of stuff going on concurrently, and so it's kind of hard to keep things in their proper place. But that being said, here the goal is just to provide a little bit of context for what's going on in the Carter years. And you can see that here, 1976 to 1981. I love this quote from, I don't remember who it is. It's a member of the Democratic National Committee. He says in 1976, in the run-up to that election, says that after Watergate, we can run an aardvark this year and win. And in a lot of ways, he's absolutely right. There's so many people after Watergate, which is sort of where we left off before break. There's so many Americans after Watergate that, again, right, wrong, or indifferent, they pin all of that on the party, not so much on the person of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Although Nixon and Ford obviously get quite a bit of blame for it, a lot of times people look at that letter that's next to those names and they see an R for Republican, and they just automatically pin it on all Republicans. So Democrats in 1976 really stand to gain everything, and they do, as you can see down there at the bottom, even in running an aardvark, quote unquote, in Jimmy Carter. It's still a pretty close election. They run against Ford, who attained the Republican nomination. They won a close victory in the presidential election, but they also win a Democratic majority in Congress. And that's pretty notable because typically throughout history, when you look at presidential politics, if a president is going to get a lot accomplished, it's because not only has he, or obviously she, it could be she, but not only has he won the White House, not only is he in office, but also his party has a majority in Congress, both houses of Congress, right? Because what happens when you have that is you have sort of uniformity across the entire spectrum of the House, the Senate, and the White House, where that's the entire chain of the creation of law, right? You don't have any point along that chain where the opposing party can sort of step in and stop and say, well, we're not going to do this. We're not going to pass this law, or we're not going to pursue this policy anymore. No, what you want is ideally, if you're a Democrat, you want a Democrat in the White House, you want a Democratic majority in the Senate, and a Democratic majority in the South. If you're a Republican, you want the same. You want a Republican in office, you want a Republican majority in Senate, and a Republican majority in the House, right? And that's what Carter gets in 1976. That's what the Democrats get in 1976. They have that sort of trifecta, if you will. And normally what that means is sort of a political watershed. It means that that party is going to really probably get most of their policies that they want enacted. Now, in the case of Carter, he was sort of doomed from the start. And I think Flippin's, even his introduction, but really throughout the whole book, which I'm obviously not going to sign the whole book, but what I think Brooks Flippin does a good job of, and what a lot of other historians have done a good job of, is pointing out that really Carter, he didn't really have much of a chance from the start. His own party says, we could run an aardvark, we could literally run anybody, and still probably win. Now, Carter, as it says there, he's former governor of Georgia. He's a peanut farmer. He's a Southern Baptist, very honest leader, and you can read obviously and flip more about his beliefs, both his religious beliefs, but then also his political beliefs. You can sort of glean that a little bit from the chapter of the book that I'm having you guys read. He's also he's a nuclear physicist, so he's obviously incredibly intelligent. But he's also a very principled leader, and in a lot of ways, those principles would come back, to sort of bite him, because they don't really mesh with the political game that he really needed to play in order to be successful in this moment. Now, he inherits a lot of problems again from sort of the early to mid 70s. Continues to be this incredibly high cost of oil. Which leads to shortages, and you can see the pictures down there, sold out today, right? Don't have any gas. We're all sold out, and we can't get any more. Pumps are closed, right? Obviously, not well received by the public. We saw this same sort of phenomena with gas prices in the early 2000s. In the early to mid 2000s, right around the time actually that I began driving, where there were oil shortages, the price of oil had gone up, and then the price of a gallon of gas had gone up. And I can remember being in high school and early in my college years, and there being a real fear that gas could reach $4 to $4.50 to $5 a gallon here in Indiana. And there were places out in California, if I remember correct, where it already was hitting $4.50, $5 or more a gallon. Right. And that's always a concern for the public, especially, sort of the post 1950s, where you have the explosion of the suburbs and you have people that are commuting longer distances to work. Right. So gas prices become, in the wake of that, a very, very important sort of barometer of where the economy is at. Right. Now, along with that and sort of contributing to that, you have inflation, and that word inflation, we talked about at a couple of different points, and it continues to rear its ugly head here. There's very high interest rates. There's also excessive borrowing. The economy, in short, to sum up, the economy is really a mess. And Carter doesn't really have much in the way of a coherent policy to deal with these issues, right? So there's a lot of domestic economic turmoil going on as Carter takes office and really through his time in office. And again, Carter does, very principled guy, but doesn't really take a stand and doesn't really have any sort of effective policies during this age. I'm actually going to skip this and come back to it. I think the Iran hostage crisis. I want to go first to detente which is right here. We introduced this term with Nixon, right? It's that easing or relaxing of tensions with the Soviet Union. Doesn't go terribly well for Carter. These relations with the Soviet Union. So remember, we said that when Carter takes office in '76, he's got a majority in the House and the Senate, a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate. I believe in '78, then the Senate. That changes. The Republicans take back a majority in the Senate, if I remember correctly. So by the time we get to 1979, Carter achieves this treaty with the Soviet premier to sort of scale back more arms. It's called SALT, which is Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is the second SALT treaty. Carter negotiates it. Finds common ground with Brezhnev, who's pictured down there in the bottom left, right next to Carter, gets this thing all ironed out, and then the Senate rejects it. The Senate, refuses to recognize the treaty, and we saw this with President Wilson at the end of World War I, right? That this has happened before, where presidents don't have unilateral power to accept treaties, right? They can negotiate treaties, but they can't just unilaterally accept them, right? The Soviets also, the Soviets are also dealing with this problem with oil, right? And you can see that there at point G, an oil grab. The Soviets need, they're like everybody else. They need oil. They need cheap oil. And so in late 1979, they are going to make some military moves in the Middle East, specifically in Afghanistan, to try to obtain some territory or control some territory that has access to massive amounts of oil. Completely destabilizes the Middle East, and it just continues to add fuel. So you have, in terms of our dealings with the Soviet Union, you have this treaty that was negotiated but then rejected by the American Senate, and then the American public looks at what the Soviets are doing in the Middle East, don't like that, and this just continues to sort of lead to a further decline in American-Soviet relations, and then finally, in 1980, there is Carter announces a boycott of the 1980 Olympics, which are to be held in Moscow, as sort of a stand against the Soviet policies in Afghanistan. And as we've seen here recently, sports, long about the 1960s and certainly into the 1970s, sports became a bigger and bigger part of sort of our American societal norms. And so this idea that we would boycott an Olympics for, sort of these political reasons, that's sort of, it's divisive, right? There are some that really appreciate, again, Carter sort of taking a stand for what he believes in. But then there's also another side that feels like this is not the right move. Almost like we're sort of cowing to the Soviets, that we're giving in to the Soviets. So again, there's controversy on either side of that. And just a really quick, 1980 is not the only year that there are boycotts. There's actually a string of boycotts from 1976 to 1984 of the Olympic Games. And you can kind of see that here. 1980, the games are in Moscow. And you can see all the countries that are in blue. So the United States, Canada, some South American nations. I believe that's East Germany is going to boycott. I believe that's Norway, right? There's several African countries that are going to boycott multiple games, right? But sort of all those countries that are in blue, it goes back to that old Cold War, democracy, capitalist versus, communist dictatorship sort of divide, right? And then when the Olympics are held in 1984 in Los Angeles, the Soviets boycott, so the Soviet Union. You then have the Eastern European bloc, right? Eastern Germany, as well as sort of those other Eastern countries, Eastern European countries, Cuba, boycotts the Olympics when they're being held in the United States. So our boycott in 1980 was certainly not the only boycott, right? Now, to sort of finish out Carter's presidency, and again, it's really in a lot of ways a doomed presidency from the start. You can't really talk about Carter's presidency without talking about the Iran hostage crisis. So there's this government that's in charge that is backed by the United States and Iran. Okay, and the Iranian people overthrow that government in 1979, and they establish what's called a theocracy. In other words, this is a government that's based on theological or religious teachings, right? Now, what this does for our purposes here is, again, there's more turmoil in the Middle East that causes a continuance of that oil shortage. There's also OPEC, which you see the picture there in the middle, which is oil and petroleum exported countries. It's a cartel. It's a legal cartel, essentially. OPEC raises their prices. Really sort of rough situation here, where then you have, and this is late 1979, you have the new Iranian leader whose name is Ayatollah Khomeini. He's sort of the revolutionary vanguard. They overtake a U.S. embassy in Tehran, and there's sort of this prisoner exchange that's proposed, right? Where you have the Shah that the U.S. had backed, the leader that the U.S. had backed, that was accused of corruption while he was the leader of Iran. The U.S. bring him back to the United States after he's overthrown for medical treatment and things like that. Well, the Ayatollah and these new Iranian revolutionaries, they want him to come back to Iran to stand trial as a criminal for his corruption, being too friendly with foreign interests, things like that. And so what happens is these revolutionaries, they take control of the U.S. embassy in Tehran, and they plan to hold those individuals that were in the American embassy hostage until the Shah is returned to Iran so that he can stand trial. And the crisis, the Iran hostage crisis, lasts for the remainder of Carter's time in office. There's a movie, I believe it's called Argo, that was made several years ago. I personally had never seen Argo, but it also has to do with the Iran hostage crisis. And the crisis does not end until after Carter has left office, very, very shortly after Carter has left office, and Reagan has taken over. So again, just the purpose of this, and I'm sure some of you will watch this, maybe some of you won't, and that's fine. But the purpose of this was just to sort of be a supplementary bit of material, just to give you a little bit of context for what you're reading here in Jay Brooks Flippin's introduction. His focus is not so much on the international. His is more on the domestic front, on the battles that Carter was having to fight domestically, specifically with what's been called or what's been termed the religious right and the politics of family. And a lot of that is, almost all of that is domestic, right? So I wanted to do this, one, to give you a little bit of context for the Carter administration on the whole, but then also just to sort of give some context where Carter really is in a rough spot from day one. So I'm going to end it there, and then hopefully we'll see as many of you as I can at 10 a.m. on Wednesday. So until then, we'll see you.